It's my pleasure to introduce my good friend Marc Weiss. Marc Weiss Consulting. If I can add a little bit of an aside, Marc is the chair of the WSTS conference, which is sort of the grandfather of this one. They are tied together. Members of the steering committee and some of the speakers participate in both. I participate in both. Marc has had a long and illustrious career in the timing world. When he was at Gnss, he was Mr. GPS, so if he seems to levitate, you'll know why. Marc, thank you. Please welcome Dr. Weiss.
Good morning. So that's no doubt forward and back on this thing, right? Okay. Talking about time, there's so many puns you can make on the word. So I'm going to talk to you about how to get a good time. I'm hoping you're having a good time today. Sorry, but I like puns. But there really is a technical aspect to this. All right. So I'll start with the sources of time. Where do we get time from? And then transfer time. How do you get time from where it's created to where you need it? And there are two general methods. There's one-way time transfer, where we just send you the time, and two-way time transfer, where we send you our time, you send us your time, and we cancel the delay. And the third really important topic is holdover. How long can you hang on to a nanosecond, a microsecond, a millisecond, whatever you need, if you lose the transfer? And I'll then conclude. So that's kind of the general picture of what I'm going to talk about. I want to say, though, one of the big confusions is that we have a human experience of time. And in industry, this time standard we're talking about, UTC, is not exactly the human experience of time. It's an engineering construct. It's something we generate and deliver. If you have this experience of time passing in your life, that's a really different thing. And there's all these philosophies about time. It's got a lot of, excuse me, it's romanticized a lot, poetry and literature. That's not what we're talking about. There's rubber meets the road here, kind of engineering. And so I'm going to try to address some of that. The basic thing is time is something we make up. It's not physically, there is a physical reality to time, but the time standard is totally artificial. What's physically real is the time interval, and that's because a clock, time comes from frequency. We have a clock is basically a frequency device, and frequency is the physically real thing. It's energy. And so you have a system running that's producing ticks at a certain rate, and then we count up these ticks, and that is what we measure as the passage of time, is how many ticks have gone by. And the zero is something we've agreed on internationally, and so you've got to go back to the source, like some national lab, in order to get time. Well, then when you send time, it's another big confusion is the difference between time and data. So when you send data, there's no problem, but very little problem with the delay. But with time signals are physical things. the stability is in the physical layer. You gotta link down to the physical pulse that is the time. Whereas communication systems are generally layered with devices that are only connected to neighboring layers. You have store and forward, and the farther you get away from the physical layer, the worse the time transfer is gonna be. But you've got to get it from a national lab. So national labs, how do they get time? Well, there's this sort of plan here that you've got national labs that have clocks, and they measure against each other. They send the data to the BIPM. That's the French acronym for the International Bureau of Weights and Measures. They collect the data from the labs, and they compute what is the general average of time, and then send it back to the lab. And then the lab outputs a tick that is UTC. But if you think about what I just said, there's a delay from when you measure the clock to when time is actually defined. And so there really is no real-time UTC. UTC, any real-time tick of UTC is a prediction of what time it's going to be when the final time is defined a month from now. So if you're saying you've got to agree with UTC to a nanosecond, can't be done. It's not defined accurately. We can't even predict it to a nanosecond. You can get UTC NIST to a nanosecond, because that's a real physical thing, and it's NIST's prediction of what time it's going to be when UTC is finally defined. So when you get UTC, you generally get it from GPS. And GPS is not UTC NIST. It's not even UTC USNO. I'll talk about that. Let me get on. The big issue with transferring time, so that's the source of time. How do you get time from NIST to where you need it? Well, you've got to deliver it. And so I have this little cartoon here to really embed in your mind what's involved with transferring. So imagine writing a letter. So how many people here remember letters? Okay, write a physical letter and say it's now 2 p.m., set your watch. And you seal it in an envelope and drop it in the mailbox. And here's the delay. This guy comes and picks it up, delivers it to the reader reads it and says it's now 2 p.m., set your watch. How useful is that? Well, in fact, it's very useful if you knew exactly how long it took to get to you from when I wrote that. And that's the issue, right? If you time-stamped when you sealed the letter and the person receiving it time-stamps when they get it, they know how long it's been since it was 2 p.m. for you, and they can now set their watch. That's what we're talking about doing, right? At the microsecond or nanosecond or whatever level you need. Okay, so the first way of transferring is one-way dissemination. So you've got the source clock, you've got the user clock, and you've got this delay, right? You send the time signal from the source to the user. How do you compensate the delay? And that's how GPS works, or GNSS. It's also how 1 PPS works. You need to know how long the cable is. So if you're getting time from GPS, first of all, the clocks are free-running clocks on the satellite. They do not have time. Time is uploaded and predicted. The time, and you also need the position of the satellite. So all that stuff is predicted and uploaded. That's about once a day. So what are the vulnerabilities with GPS or GNSS? I think for this audience in the US, it's GPS that we care about. So first of all, there's a clock in space, and its time is predicted. That can be an error. How many people heard a year ago of this 13 microsecond error? Right? that was a problem with the upload. It had to be uploaded from the ground, and there was a vulnerability that actually caused a problem. And then you want the signal to come from the satellite to you on the ground. Well, it has to go through the ionosphere and troposphere, which add additional delays and can create errors, and those things have to be measured or modeled in some way. But then there's all kinds of things that happen right at the receiver. You can have this perfect signal coming from space. You put an antenna up in the wrong place, in the wrong way, and you get junk, you get garbage. You have to know the coordinate, you have to know your position. There's multipath interference. If you happen to be in a city like New York and you put an antenna out the window or on the side of the building, lots of problems. And then the signals have to go through cables. How long does it take for the signal to go through the cable? So those are the kinds of issues with GPS. And that's generally the way you get UTC is from GPS. That's the most common way of getting UTC because it's broad, it's across the world, it's global. But as we've talked about, the signals are incredibly weak. I think it's like a 100-watt light bulb in space received on the ground. I forget the exact numbers, but it's very, very weak. It's deliberately done that way so that the signals don't interfere with anything. They're like noise. They're at the level of the noise, and it's really a very clever system that you can get the receiver can take this zero signal power and pump it up with process to a real signal that gives you incredible accuracy. It's an amazing system. But there are failure modes in the system. It's incredibly reliable. I should say it's incredibly reliable, but not 100%. And that's the issue. You get dependent on it, you expect it to always be there, and then one day, there's a problem. They don't penetrate buildings also. That's another issue with GPS. Okay, the other most common way of transferring time is two-way comparison. So again, you've got the clock, which is the source. You've got the clock you're trying to receive, and then you send the signal from clock 1 to clock 2. You send the signal, you send the time of clock 2 back to clock 1, and if those delays are the same in both directions, you can cancel the delay exactly. Of course, they're never exactly the same, and that's one of the big issues with two-way. So again, there's no free lunch. There's no simple ways to just give you the time. You know, I could tell you it's now whatever. That's not what you need, right? You need to get a time pulse at the trade in the software. Boy, lots of problems. Okay, so this is sort of a really simple equation of how it all works. There'll be a lot more information. I think Doug Arnold is going to talk about two-way systems. One of the issue is traceability. You want UTC. Two-way just transfers from point A to point B. If the source is traceable, then you get some traceability at the other end. How do you get the source to be traceful? I would say also that there's a lot of rumor that PTP is better than NTP. It really depends on how they're connected to the physical layer. If PTP is going over a noisy network and the timestamps are done in sloppy ways, you get lousy PTP, just like you get lousy NTP, depending on what you consider good or bad, right? I mean, a millisecond could be the best thing in the world, or it could be crappy. Okay, if the source, the grandmaster, depends on GPS, which many of them do, now you've got all the vulnerabilities of GPS at the source, and then you've got the vulnerabilities of the transfer system on top of it. So lots of things to pay attention to. I talked about store and forward buffers. If you're going through the public internet, you know, most computers these days use NTP over the public internet to set their time. The next speaker has its biggest NTP network in the world. Probably most of you who have your laptops here are being set to UTC NIST via Judah Levine's NTP system. The best you're going to get, really, in the real world across the public internet is a millisecond. And at the speed of light, a millisecond is 1,000,000 feet. So you're off by, if you're using that for positioning, you'd be off by 1,000,000 feet just starting off the bat, at best. But you're not. You're using it for a human level thing. All you want mostly is something on the order of a second. So a millisecond is, it's God's gift to man. The other issue, of course, is that delays in the two directions are never equal. How equal are they? Are they equal enough that you get accuracy? The timestamps can have errors, especially if it's a software timestamp instead of a hardware timestamper. I think Doug may talk about this more. And then, of course, getting through the networks. I think I've talked enough about that. Okay, the last topic is holdover. Here you can really save yourselves a lot of problems. If what you need is a microsecond and you have a clock that'll hold a microsecond for a month, you can get a clock that'll hold a microsecond for many months. A cesium standard. Well, I'll talk a little about that. The clock can also detect and eliminate error sources. That's another thing is an attack can pull off the time of your clock, particularly GPS spoofing. There's no error indication at all. You have no idea that you're wrong, but you can be pulled off without any notice that there's any problem. However, if you've got a good local clock, it makes it harder to pull you off. How good is good? How much does it cost? Well, you generally get what you pay for. This is a very rough oscillator comparison. I pulled it up from a 2011 paper. The reason I mentioned 2011 is because it refers to the CSAC as rubidium that was not commercialized at that point. It now is commercialized as cesium. And if you look, better is going down and to the left. So more time accuracy means lower instability, and less power dissipation means off to the left. And so the CSAC was a big innovation because it jumped off that curve. There'd been this, sort of, you can only do so well with so much power. And then the CSAC showed that you could actually do significantly better with less power. I will emphasize that a CSAC can be a cesium chip-scale atomic clock. It's not the same as a cesium full-up beam tube standard. Also, the price is very different. But this picture, the right-hand side is the timing instability over one day. That is, how well can you hold a microsecond? And according to this picture, the cheap rubidiums can hold a microsecond about a day. The cesium can hold it 100 days, maybe 1,000 days. An H-maser could hold it for years. But if what you want is a nanosecond, now you're going to need cesium and H-masers to hold it for days or longer. So that's the picture. I don't know how much time I have. There's good. So UTC must come from a national lab, and you have to account for the delay, the signal physical delay from the lab to the user. GPS is a one-way system, has pros and cons. NTP and PTP are two-way systems with their own pros and cons. And highly reliable time transfer requires redundant, multiply, differently routed systems. And that's my talk. Thank you for your attention. You need the microphone.
Thanks. What do you think of CDMA-based time sources for PTP?
Okay, so CDMA, we're talking about transmitting time from a telecom wireless base station, right?
Right. Yep.
And then you have to ask, well, how did the base station get time? So it's a transfer mechanism, and it's certainly good to have as many transfer mechanisms as you can get. You still need to get the time into the base station somehow, and typically it's GPS. And so you have all the vulnerabilities of GPS getting into the base station, and then you've got to account for the time delay from the base station to the user. And so do they have a two-way mechanism? Typically it's just we transmit it, you get it, and you use it. If you got position, you can solve the delay.
Yeah, now I was just wondering if they had any alternative source, any of the major networks, other than GPS.
You know, the networks don't talk in detail about, this is proprietary information, I don't know what they do. They don't talk about what they do very much in terms of the details of their timing networks. So no, I don't know if they've got alternate sources.
Okay, thanks.
I would guess not, though.
Leon Lobo from NPL in the UK. One of the critical changes in Europe is about moving from relative timing and synchronization for organizations trading with the venue to the element of absolute timing and the 100 microsecond requirement for traceability of the timestamp. From the point of view of the SEC offering, putting forward the 100 microsecond or business clock synchronization to Gnss clocks, and everyone using GPS, this is the question around traceability now, in terms of how firms are going to prove their traceability to Gnss clocks when they're using GPS, which doesn't have that link.
So the question is, how do you prove traceability? You need some calibration path, right? You need some calibrated route that says, this is against NIST, this is against your local clock, how do you know how good it is? And I think Judah's going to talk about that in the next talk, so I'll leave it for him.
Thank you.
Thank you.